Every night, Emily counted her tips at the edge of her bed, hoping each dollar would add up to just a little bit more. Her room was small, barely big enough to fit the second-hand dresser, the creaky twin bed, and the plastic chair she'd found on the curb last spring. But for Emily, it was a sanctuary, a place where she could dream, if only for a moment, about what life could be. By day, Emily's world was filled with coffee orders and clattering dishes at Mel's Diner, a worn-out place that had seen better days just like many of its customers. She'd worked there since she was 19, taking double shifts to keep her head above water after her parents passed, their tiny inheritance swallowed up by medical bills. Emily had once dreamed of becoming a nurse, but that dream had faded into the background when life became a series of bills, debts, and long hours at Mel's. That evening, as she stood behind the counter wiping down menus and watching the door, her eyes fell on a familiar face, a man in an old army jacket with a day's worth of stubble, his posture somehow slouched yet alert. He was one of her regulars, someone who came in every couple of nights, ordering the same thing without fuss, a coffee and a bowl of soup. She knew little about him, but he always left a small, folded dollar bill tucked neatly beneath his cup, a silent thank you for her service. Tonight, though, there was something different in his manner, a heaviness in his gaze as he looked around the diner, like he was taking it all in for the first time. Emily noticed the way his fingers tapped against the table, his gaze moving over each corner of the room, as if weighing the place for its quiet dignity. "Evening," she greeted, her voice warm as she reached for the coffee pot. "The usual." He nodded, giving her a tight smile, though his eyes held a spark of something that intrigued her, curiosity, or maybe even kindness she hadn't seen before. She poured his coffee, her hands working automatically. She was about to leave him to his meal when he spoke, his voice low. "You've been working here a while, haven't you?" She blinked, taken aback. It wasn't often her customers asked about her life, especially those like him, who seemed to carry their own burdens quietly. "Since I was 19, she said, a slight pride sneaking into her tone. "I guess it shows, huh?" He smiled faintly, though his eyes softened. "I'd call that dedication." Emily laughed, shrugging off the compliment. "Dedication, maybe, but I'd call it survival," she admitted, her words coming out more honest than she intended. The man tilted his head, his gaze lingering on her with a thoughtful expression. "Most people don't keep that kind of spirit for long." Emily wanted to shrug it off, but something about the way he said it made her pause. There was a strange comfort in his words, a subtle reminder that someone, even a stranger, had noticed the effort she put in every day. She gave a small nod and a quiet thanks, turning to the kitchen to check on his order. When she returned with his soup, he looked up from his coffee and cleared his throat. "Ever think about going back to school? I mean, you seem like someone who'd do well with a chance." She laughed, though it wasn't from amusement. "In another life, maybe. I wanted to be a nurse once," she confessed, her voice low. "But that ship sailed a long time ago." He didn't push, just nodded, looking down into his coffee with a thoughtful expression that seemed to drift elsewhere. The rest of his meal passed in quiet conversation, small exchanges about the weather and the local news. But as he left, she noticed a neatly folded envelope tucked beside his cup. She picked it up, assuming it was his usual tip, but as she unfolded it, she froze. Inside were 10 crisp $100 bills, far more than anything she'd ever made in a single night. Emily's heart pounded as she stared at the money, disbelief flooding her. She rushed outside, but the man had already disappeared into the night, the faint silhouette of his figure fading down the empty street. She looked around, half expecting to see him turn back, but there was only the silent hum of the streetlights. For the rest of her shift, Emily couldn't stop thinking about him, about the kindness in his eyes, the way he'd asked about her dreams without any trace of pity. She wasn't sure if she felt touched, embarrassed, or grateful. As the night wore on, though, she felt a warmth settling over her heart, a strange sense of possibility stirring in her. The next day, she tried to shake off the memory as she clocked in for her morning shift. Yet, even as she took orders, poured coffee, and ran food to tables, her mind kept drifting back to the stranger's kind gesture. She wondered about him, who he was, what he saw in her that made him give so freely. She had told herself she'd save the money, use it for bills or maybe a new pair of work shoes. But part of her couldn't resist daydreaming that, somehow, this money was meant for something more. It wasn't until a week later that she saw him again. This time, he was wearing a plain black coat and looked almost out of place, like someone used to being surrounded by luxury rather than linoleum floors and fluorescent lights. He gave her a nod as he took his usual seat, and she felt a sudden flood of relief, as though she'd been waiting for him without realizing it. As she approached his table, he looked up, his expression unreadable. "Did you find the tip?" he asked, a hint of humor in his tone. "I did," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "It was, well, unexpected. Thank you." He nodded, watching her with an intensity that made her feel as though she were under a spotlight. "Good, I hoped it might help." She looked down, shifting her weight, her voice softening. "If I'm honest, it did more than that. But I have to ask why." The man studied her for a long moment before he replied, his words careful. "Because people like you don't come around often. You treat everyone here with kindness and you work hard, probably harder than anyone should have to. I've been watching and I thought you deserved a little support." His words left her speechless, a warmth filling her chest. She wanted to thank him, but somehow, that word didn't feel big enough. They continued their conversation, sharing bits and pieces of their lives between her serving other customers. She learned his name was Jack, and that he'd once come from a place not so different from hers, a small town, working his way up from nothing. Yet, as she listened to him talk, something about his story didn't add up. There was a polished edge to his words, a certain poise that didn't quite match the image he portrayed. Days turned into weeks, and Jack continued to visit the diner, always choosing her section, sometimes even staying past her shift just to chat a bit longer. Their conversations deepened, and he'd ask her questions about her life, her struggles, her dreams. One rainy night, after her shift had ended and the diner had closed, Jack waited for her by the door. "Can I walk you home?" he offered. Surprised, she accepted, grateful for the company on a cold night. As they walked, he spoke about the things he'd seen, the struggles he'd witnessed in others' lives. And then, in a quiet moment, he finally admitted the truth. "Emily," he began, pausing under the streetlight that cast long shadows on the empty road. "There's something I need to tell you." She looked at him, her heart suddenly racing. "I haven't been entirely honest. I'm not just some regular guy wandering into diners. I came here because I'm a part of this community, in a way. But not like you'd expect." He hesitated, as though weighing his words. I'm Jack Hadley." Emily's jaw dropped, her eyes wide with shock. Jack Hadley was the man who owned half the businesses in town, whose name was practically legendary in the small-town papers, whispered about for his wealth and influence. Yet, here he was, standing in front of her, dressed like anyone else, his eyes filled not with pride, but with a gentleness that took her by surprise. "I know it sounds strange," he continued, his voice steady. "But I was looking for something different when I came in that night. I wanted to see what people were like when they didn't know me. And I found you, someone who's genuine, who sees others for who they are, not what they can give her." Emily felt her throat tighten, her mind struggling to catch up with everything he'd just revealed. She wanted to speak, to tell him that she understood, but she didn't know how. After a long moment, Jack reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope, pressing it gently into her hands. "I've seen what you give every day in this world, and I want to give something back to you. Inside is a scholarship fund. Enough to cover your tuition, books, whatever you need if you want to go back to school." Emily stared at the envelope, disbelief filling her as the words sank in. "But, Jack, I don't even know what to say," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then don't say anything yet," he replied, his voice soft, steady. "Just think about it. I see potential in you, Emily. And I want to help you chase it." As he walked away, Emily stood beneath the streetlight, clutching the envelope as though it were a lifeline. In that moment, she realized that her life had changed in a way she could never have imagined. The choice was hers now to take a step toward her dreams, to accept the kindness that had been so freely given, and to believe in herself the way Jack Hadley believed in her. For days, Emily didn't know what to do with the envelope. She'd placed it under her pillow at night, held it in her hands in the quiet early hours, feeling its weight and wondering if maybe it would disappear by morning. But every day it was still there, waiting for her to make a decision she was scared to even imagine. At the diner, she kept her routine as usual. The locals who filled the booths and stools had no idea of the change in her life. And somehow, that comforted her. Life was steady there, with familiar faces and orders she knew by heart. But Jack didn't come back. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again. And she wondered if he'd intended for their last meeting under the streetlight to be a final goodbye, leaving her with a choice she had to make on her own. One late afternoon, Emily took a walk down to the community college in town. It was only a few blocks away from the diner, a modest campus with low red brick buildings and students who milled about, chatting and laughing. She watched them from a bench, observing the backpacks, the laptops, the groups of friends talking about classes she could only dream of attending. Her heart ached with the faintest glimmer of hope, a feeling she'd nearly forgotten. What if she could join them? What if she could join them? What if she could finally learn, grow, and build something real with her life, something beyond the endless shifts and worry-filled nights? Jack had said he saw something in her, something worth investing in, and part of her wanted desperately to believe it. But fear held her back. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she failed? A light tap on her shoulder jolted her from her thoughts. She looked up and saw Mrs. Robbins, her old high school biology teacher. They hadn't seen each other in years, yet Mrs. Robbins recognized her immediately. "Emily. My goodness, it's been ages. How are you?" Mrs. Robbins asked, her eyes warm and familiar. Emily smiled, though she struggled to keep her composure. I'm okay," she replied, her voice quiet. Mrs. Robbins sat beside her, a comforting presence. "I always thought you'd end up on a college campus. You had so much potential, such a knack for science. I still talk about your final project sometimes," she added with a fond smile. Hearing those words, Emily felt a rush of emotion. She remembered that project vividly, the late nights, the excitement she'd felt while working on something she loved. Back then, she'd believed her life could go anywhere. And here she was, on the outside looking in. "I miss it," she admitted softly. "I miss learning. I miss having a dream." Mrs. Robbins reached over, giving Emily's hand a gentle squeeze. "It's never too late, If you still want it, you can make it happen." Emily nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She'd needed to hear those words, to have someone else believe in her. When she finally said goodbye to Mrs. Robbins, she knew she couldn't walk away from this chance, no matter how afraid she felt. That night, she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter in Jack's steady handwriting, simple and straightforward. "Emily. This scholarship is yours, and it comes with no conditions other than that you follow what feels right to you. If you choose not to use it, that's your choice, and I'll respect it. But if you ever do, if you decide to step toward something new, know that I'll be cheering you on, even if you can't see me. Yours, Jack." She found herself smiling through tears, clutching the letter close as a decision settled in her heart. She couldn't turn back now. The next day, she went to the admissions office, filled out her application, and used the funds Jack had given her to enroll in a few introductory courses. It felt like stepping into a new world, one that both excited and terrified her. But each time doubt crept in, she remembered Jack's words, his unwavering belief in her, and it pushed her forward. Over the following months, her life transformed. She spent her days balancing classes and shifts at the diner, and though it was exhausting, she loved it. She soaked up every lecture, each new fact igniting a long-buried passion for learning. Her professors noticed her enthusiasm, her curiosity, and they encouraged her, feeding her newfound confidence. She was thriving, rediscovering the parts of herself she thought she'd lost. One evening, as she was cleaning up the diner after her shift, the door jingled. She looked up and froze. There, standing in the soft glow of the fluorescent lights, was Jack. He looked almost the same, though his jacket was sharper, his shoes polished, a subtle shift that gave away his wealth more than he might have intended. Emily felt a surge of joy and surprise, her heart racing as she wiped her hands on her apron. "Jack," she breathed, unable to hide her smile. "I didn't think I'd see you again." He grinned, a warmth in his eyes that she'd never quite seen before. "Well, I couldn't stay away forever. I had to come back and see how my favorite student was doing." They sat in their usual booth, and Emily found herself laughing as she shared stories from her classes, the challenges, the victories, the way her life had come alive in ways she'd never imagined. Jack listened intently, pride radiating from him as she spoke, and she realized that she owed him more than she could ever repay, not just for the money, but for the faith he'd placed in her. When their conversation grew quiet, he looked at her with that same thoughtful expression he'd had that first night, the one that seemed to see through her to the heart of who she was. He began softly, "You've done all of this on your own. You had the strength all along. I just wanted to give you the chance to see it." Her eyes misted, and she reached across the table, taking his hand. "I don't know if I'd have had the courage without you," she whispered, her gratitude overwhelming. "You changed my life." Jack squeezed her hand, his gaze steady and kind. "No, Emily," he replied, "you changed your own life. I just got to witness it." They sat in silence for a moment, and she knew that whatever happened next, she would carry his kindness with her forever. He'd shown her the way forward, and she'd taken each step with a courage she hadn't realized was there. As he left that night, she watched him disappear down the street, his silhouette fading into the shadows. But this time, Emily knew it wasn't an ending, it was the beginning of everything she'd been waiting for. And as she locked up the diner, her heart felt light, full of dreams and hope, knowing that she would never walk this path alone.